Julie, thanks so much. It's great to be with all of you tonight, and an honor for me to be a part of this conversation around Live Through This. I first had the pleasure of meeting Anne, was it 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, long time ago.
We did an interview in the studios of WBEZ about the music project, which was such an amazing conversation for me to be a part of. And I've known Patsy for years and admired her work greatly and knew about the two of you in this collaboration from our conversations. But I thought I would begin because I didn't know the full backstory on this project, really, despite my connections to each of you, until just the other day when we were talking in advance. So where did the idea for a book of first-person stories about sexual violence come about?
You know, I think we both felt very strongly that this is an issue that really disappears people. You know, that the world knows sexual violence occurs, but the world doesn't often see the faces, see the names, really encounter the humanity of survivors. And Patsy and I first met actually through Sunny Fisher, who's here somewhere this evening.
Back here.
Go, Sunny. And I went to her to say that I was really interested in a project that would tell the story of not just who a survivor is in terms of the violence he or she has endured, but who they are as a whole person. And of course, Sunny immediately said, there's this amazing photographer you need to meet, Patricia Evans. And when we came together, I think we both shared a passion for telling a story in a different way, photographing people beautifully, talking about who they are more broadly, and creating a safe space for survivors to really share their stories.
Well, and Patsy, this subject had been a part of your work for a long time. And Jamie, your husband, had written Working with Available Life. And by the time Anne came along, you told me you were sort of done with this as a thematic project for you, the idea of really interrogating the space of sexual violence. What was it about this opportunity that said, wait a second, there may be more to say here as a photographer?
I have to correct you first, though.
Yeah.
It's been 10 years, which is a long time, but it wasn't 50 years that you talked about the music
We
video.
didn't have that severe writer in photography.
It was a long time. Yeah, well, Jamie's book came out in the late 90s, and I had done a photo installation that I had also exhibited in the late 90s. And when that was over with, you know, when we got through the book tour, and I just felt like, okay, I've done what I'm going to do. I had been interviewed. I'd been on, you know, various radio programs. I just felt like, you know, that was enough for me, talking about this subject and dealing with it. And then when Anne came along, I really did think about it. I didn't just say, oh, good, I can't wait. But I did think about it, and I thought, you know, not a whole lot has changed, and we're still not seeing faces, and we're not still seeing people come forward and names, and it just seemed like it was a good idea, and the idea of meeting people all across the country, you know, if that's what we were going to do, and we didn't really know that, but, you know, I thought it was a challenge I was willing to take on, and you know, I'm certainly very glad I did.
Yeah, there's an intimacy to the pictures that accompany the essay, the essays and the stories. There's an intimacy to the essays themselves. What was your process like as the two of you really sat down for interviews and gathered the stories that make up those that are in Live Through This?
It's interesting because when we went into those interviews, we didn't really have a formal process. Yeah. You know, we actually started with 5 women across the country. You know, we ultimately had interviewed and photographed over 100 people. What we knew we wanted to do was really get to know them. And we talked together about the fact that you don't learn about who someone is by asking them to describe to you the most traumatic event of their life. That's part of the fabric of their life. But they're made up of so much more. They're shaped by that violence, but they're not defined by it. So the question then becomes what does define them? And I think what Patsy and I felt very strongly about was that we would travel to them, that we would immerse ourselves in their lives. So when we would first meet, we'd have dinner and interact and get to know one another. And we didn't talk necessarily about violence specifically. And then the other thing that we did, and Patsy will be able to speak to this so much more eloquently than I can, she shot while we talked. And there was no dividing line in this space. So the beautiful thing about working with Patsy for me was that both of us had survived violence ourselves, so we had a huge amount of trust. I trust her, I believe she trusted, and at that time when we didn't know each other as well, trusted me. And survivors felt that trust, and at any moment, one of us would recede or move forward. But Patsy, very early on, came to feel really strongly about the idea that she wanted to take the photos during those conversations, because you catch those beautiful moments when someone's reflecting on their own life, when often I would feel that Patsy and I would almost disappear. And that person would be in the moment of their memory. And it was quite beautiful, to be able to see that. Is that?
Yeah, I think it made a big difference to me. We did try both ways, where I would do just a portrait session, and we started with people we knew. Originally we started with people we knew their backstories, we knew them, and then we moved on to most people we didn't know. And I felt like we kind of, the two of us together, created an atmosphere.
Yeah.
And there was something, it wasn't that I wanted somebody expressing a particular emotion, you just wanted them to be inside that atmosphere of whatever it was we were talking about. And it's true, it was like we disappeared,
Yeah. Which is so interesting to think about it, because as we just started the conversation, you made reference to the idea that in many respects, victims of and survivors of sexual violence are disappeared by the media and disappeared by the journalists who are capturing and telling the stories, literally and figuratively. The legal system, every other aspect of life sort of disappears the individual who is most directly affected. And yet, in the actual process of gathering their stories, you disappeared to let them shine. It's quite an interesting duality when you think about it that way.
Yeah, that's a good point.
One of the other things I think that struck me about these stories is your effort to really talk about these individuals in multiple dimensions, in three-dimensional lives. And they often talked about sort of the self prior to the encounter, prior to the incident of violence. And yet, who they were after changed, yes, but full and moving through a process of recovery. What did you learn from talking with so many women and men about their journeys that stood out for you? Is there a common thread that resonates?
I have to say, I think the common thread, and this flies in the face of sort of the way in America we like to talk about rugged individualism and heroes and people who manage to pull themselves up from a traumatic situation. I think the common thread is that no one rebuilds their life alone. And the most courageous people you've ever met, people who strike you as strong and independent and capable of weathering any storm, when you scratch the surface, when you really listen to them, there was someone who was there for them. There was a pivotal moment when some social system either supported them or somehow gave them the one thing they needed. That there's a way in which I really believe that the thing standing between someone who's lived through violence, kind of stepping back and staying in that moment and moving forward, very often is that someone or some institution around them felt called and compelled to take care of them. And you would hear that over and over, whether it was their community of faith, their partner, their best friend. We had an extraordinary number of people talk about the power of their pets, which, as a dog lover, pardon me. But you had a whole way in which people rebuild their lives arm in arm with others. And it's easier for us to think that's not so, because we can then say, if you're a strong, resilient person, you'll get through this, and I can wash my hands of solving that problem. But the truth is, that is the common. If there's one common factor, I think that's the common factor.
Yeah. For both of you, gathering these stories, capturing through photography these stories and the individuals, Patsy, for you, what have you come to understand as you've sort of interrogated the space for your own life and for the lives of so many others?
Yeah, I think about it. I mean, I totally agree with what Ann said, but in visual terms, what really stands out for me is that when I look at the whole series of photographs, many of them are not in the book, and look at all these women's faces and the people that we've met, I think what it really says is that this could be any of you. This is old and young and any color and under any circumstance, and
age, income, you name it. Yeah.
You name it, and that shouldn't be a depressing thought. Like, it's just that these folks, these women have survived, and they all, they look beautiful. They're leading lives that you can understand, and it's not something that you need to step away from and cover up and make a secret. These are people like your next door neighbor, and I think when you see all of the faces, and definitely read the stories, but see all the faces, you get that feeling.
Are there particular individuals, as you think now, that sort of stood out as particularly exemplary of that idea that Patsy and you were talking about a second ago, Ann?
Well, it's interesting. I was going to add something to what Patsy said, which is that even when I'm thinking about some of the stories that we captured internationally, the women of Atenco, Mexico, who are victims of rape and torture at the hands of Mexican police. And it's a very heartbreaking story. It's a high priority still for Amnesty International. But what was striking for me is when we went down to interview them, there was the temptation to say, okay, this sort of violence occurs here and not here. And certainly it's inarguable that there are huge issues with the police force and security in Mexico, and that there's a huge amount of violence against women that's, that it occurs at the hands of police. But having said that, one of the really interesting moments was when they came to Chicago to talk about what they had gone through in Mexico, and had women coming up to them and saying, I was the victim of brutality at the hands of the police in my own city. And it's only to say that even when we look at a form of violence and think it only exists in one community, very often when you listen to survivors, you realize that the connections between these stories are much greater. I think for me, the other, it's hard to say, there's so many extraordinary people in this book. For me as a writer, interviewing Dorothy Allison, who wrote Bastard out of Carolina, and including her in the book, was incredibly moving. And I don't know how many of you have read that gorgeous book. But in some ways, it's about a relationship between a mother and a daughter, and the mother turning a blind eye to the violence being done to Dorothy. And yet, you meet Dorothy and encounter her love for her mother and her sense of the complexity of why people ignore violence, why they do nothing. And that as horrible a mistake as that is, the complex factors that lead to that, and it demands that you look more closely.
Yeah.
And that was hard for me in a way, because I wanted to look at the people who turn away and say, you're the villain, we're the heroes. And in a certain sense, we recognize some of those flaws in ourselves. And I think those were the stories that made me most uncomfortable, but also were most transformative, where it starts to, what someone's saying is sort of kind of nipping at the heels of an idea that you're very wed to.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. There's a diversity of experience and background you touched on, and there is a diversity in the way in which the individuals come to terms with this
Yeah.
element in their life. Yeah.
Yeah, the story, well, I can think of, many stories. One in particular that we did very early on, the story of Helen Finch and Karen Palmer, and the idea that an 82-year-old woman and a 30-something woman would be raped by the same serial rapist, not know each other until the trial is over, and then meet each other and become fast friends. I mean, mother and daughter friends as a bond. And it's in the book, I think, that Karen says to Helen, the older woman, "I'm so sorry this happened to you at your age." Yeah. And Helen says to Karen, "No, I only have to live with this for a certain amount of time. I'm so sorry
it happened
to you. At such a young age."
Yeah.
It's really striking to me
Yeah.
that could even happen, that they could find each other. They took such pleasure in each other. They had so much fun.
Well, and that's the other thing. Some of the pictures show that kind of energy and dynamism. These aren't pictures that are with women in shadows or forlorn. There's a whole range of artistry, I think, that you brought to the individual portraits here in the book. I want to take questions from those of you who are here, but let me, before we do that, just quickly say, I was struck by the very first line in the book. You say, this is a book of hope. Why?
Because I think you can't encounter these stories and not feel hopeful. These are people who have gone through, in some cases, the sorts of things that we never imagined we will go through. And they've come out on the other side, not only reconstructing their lives and living. Every one of these people in this book, whether it's Sister Fa, who's a huge rap star using rap to address violence against women, or a Dorothy Allison, or a Helen who was speaking out in her 80s, they're doing remarkable things with their life. But the reason I wanted to open with the notion that this is a story of hope is that they are hoping that we hear them. They believe in us. You don't share your story. There's this notion that we're sharing our stories because it's personally therapeutic. It's not always personally therapeutic. It can be painful. And in many ways, the reason people share these stories is they are hoping we hear them, and they're hoping we do something. And that hope was the consistent factor. No one came into our meetings with anything other than this deep desire and belief that their voices can be transformative. And when I encountered that belief, that to me was probably the most moving aspect of this project. This notion that despite everything, and in many cases these are people who had been failed by the legal system or had been failed by their families or friends, sometimes yes, sometimes no, still they're hopeful. And that, to me, speaks to something almost eternal in us. That's the last thing that goes, is hope. And all of these people had that.
It's remarkable. Let's take questions from any of you. What questions might you have for Anne and Patricia? Yes.
And I was reflecting, before I left, I was watching a news segment on Bill Cosby allegations.
Yeah.
And I have been thinking of this in connection with you and reflecting on how alone Barbara Bowman must have been 30 years ago. And with the hope now that what you're doing and what she had tried to do those years ago, and now again having the courage
Let me just repeat the essence of that for those who didn't have a chance to hear it. The woman was saying before she came, she was watching news about the latest concerning Bill Cosby and thinking about Barbara Bowman and the courage of coming forth 30 years later, and what has Anne witnessed, if anything, that may have changed in the 30 years that's passed around these issues. Yeah.
That's such a great question, Deanna, actually, because the stories that I think in a certain sense most have stayed with me aren't necessarily the ones in the book. They're women like that who experience violence during a cultural moment or at the hands of someone so socially protected that they did not feel that they in any way, shape, or form could come forward. And I wish I could say that moment has passed. I think that we've moved forward tremendously, but in the end, when women have lived through violence, the world looks at them, the world looks at the perpetrator of the violence, and the world does a sort of calculation. You know, do I believe you or do I believe you? If I believe you, what will it cost me? If I believe you, who do I have to challenge? And so as much as we've made this extraordinary social and legal progress, women are still out there feeling that alone. And so somehow we've got to, I think our hope with this book is that if we found a body of stories where women are coming forward and saying, this has been my experience, and I'm sharing it for no reason other than for you to understand this issue, that the world will look differently at the kind of stories that Deanna is referring to, or Anne is referring to, that the world is going to say, we have to respond differently.
Let's take one. We have time for one or two more questions? Yeah. Yes. How did you find the women?
We started with women that we both knew, maybe five. I think we had 5 women, and then and then I think there may have been a few friends of theirs, but then we put it up as a website, and on the website we put up a survey that you could fill out, and it had a lot of questions on it, and from there, they had a choice of saying they would allow us to come and talk to them and take their photograph. And pretty soon, we had many more people than we could actually do. We had to make sort of decisions about, you know, what age and, you know, that kind of thing. But we had way many more.
In terms of just the mix.
Yeah.
Just the mix. We needed, by the end, we needed to sort of have a mix.
Yeah.
So we didn't get to everybody.
It's quite amazing because early on I remember talking to someone about wanting to do this, and they said, you're going to be lucky if you have 10 people. The Voices and Faces Project now has collected the stories of over 400 women. And we have 200 additional survivors who have come through our testimonial writing program who are out there sharing their stories. So there's a hunger that people have to have their story told, either to tell their own story or to know their story is going to be told in a way that honors them and that reflects the totality of their person. And I think we could probably have volumes 3, 4, and 5 of this book. We're not going to, don't worry. No more parties. But people want to be heard. They want to be known. So it was very moving that there was that kind of response.
Yeah. Did you have to work on terms or in the conversations with those who didn't come forth voluntarily, the ones that you reached out to? What were the conversations like that sort of enabled the 3 of you to gather? Was anybody resistant to it or needed to sort of think it over? How did that
At the beginning?
At the beginning, yeah. I'm not sure I want to be in on it. Yeah.
I don't remember having anything like
No.
that. You know,
Which speaks to your point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When it came to the actual book, when we got to the, you know, a year ago, we did have a few people who at the very last minute said, and they had various reasons, but it was just a couple of people.
Yeah.
But no, we never had that.
Let's take one more question if there is. Yeah.
I was wondering if first of all, congratulations on the second printing
Thank
of the
you.
book. But I was wondering if you had an opinion on the present political climate, given the amazing number of astonishingly ignorant comments from elected officials regarding sexual violence, specifically rape. Have we regressed that far culturally, or for whatever reason do you think these elected officials feel emboldened to voice attitudes that they've always held?
I think some of those comments arguably are people who are just, they don't get it. They probably never are going to get it. I think in general, we live in a society where people are resistant to confronting issues like this. And when they do, they don't have the language for doing it very often, which is in no way to excuse those ignorant and insensitive comments. But it is to say that if we as a society don't start talking about it more, we're going to have elected officials who represent that level of ignorance, and we have to address that.
That reminds me, the subtitle of this book, I think, is really telling. We've been talking a lot about those who want their stories to be heard and the act of telling the story. The subtitle is Listening to the Stories of Sexual Violence Survivors, and I think the other piece of this is listening. How important do you think the act of listening is as a society for this?
I think it's huge. I mean, I think that was the reason that, whether they knew it or not, people came forward, was that we were there to listen, and I think that's why there's 400 people who've filled out these surveys. It's overwhelming that it's so many people. I think if you look at what's happening now on college campuses, it's beginning to happen that women are coming forward and saying, listen to me and believe me.
And really listening to someone is a very active process. It's not passive. And it's interesting, I think, when we were in the midst of working on this project, and I write about this in the book, I was rereading Edith Wharton's House of Mirth and came upon that wonderful statement about a silence that is compassion holding its breath. And people know the difference between a silence and a silence in which you are there with them and you care about them and you're allowing them to say things that might be painful and uncomfortable and difficult. And the one thing, another consistent thing we hear from survivors is the people that allowed them to speak and actually listen to the dark stuff and the difficult stuff, those people transform their lives. And we're not really encouraged to listen in the cultural moment we're in now.
Right.
We're very much about tweeting and stating and posting, and we're a monologue-based culture in some ways. And Al's question about our political discourse speaks to that. We're not really listening to one another. So in a sense, there were broader lessons that we learned in this book about how to engage with someone in a way that leads to understanding.
It's a beautiful collection of stories and photographs that speaks to the power of story, the power of listening, and really the power of humanity. I want to congratulate Anne and Patsy so much on this. Thank you so much for this. I know that you'll be here to talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.